You're listening to Encounters live from 1 Mill Street in Leamington, Spa. My name is Luke Robert Mason, a postgraduate student at the University of Warwick, and my guest today is Professor Steve Fuller, Emeritus Professor of Social Epistemology
Emeritus?
at the... just Professor.
I'm not emeritus.
One day, maybe. You'll get the office and the library card ad infinitum. Today, we're going to discuss some of the ideas in his new book, Back to the University's Future, The Second Coming of Humboldt, which outlines how we might retrieve the enlightenment mission of the university as a place that encourages free expression and the translation and publicity of new forms of knowledge. In other words, a place where students are encouraged to dare to know. So, Steve, I guess my first question is, why do we need to look backwards to look forwards towards the future of the university?
Well, first of all, I would say that that we still, in a way, pay lip service to what the original modern idea of the university is, and this is what's associated with this guy Humboldt, who I'll say something a little bit about later. But when we talk about the academic and the persona of the academic, we talk about someone who is a teacher and a researcher at the same time, and in that sense, and somehow that combination of functions is somehow meant to be a kind of role model for what it's like to be a kind of rational, critical inquirer in society at large. And that's kind of what the modern image of the academic in the university is, which this guy Humboldt, who was a Prussian education minister in the early 19th century, put forward in Berlin and became the basis for the University of Berlin, which was kind of the flagship modern university for more than a century, actually. And so what we're talking about, so what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to be both a teacher and a researcher at the same time? Well, it means, first of all, that you're open-minded, because what you're teaching isn't something that's a closed issue. It's something that, in fact, you're continuing to research on, right? And you have to convey that kind of mentality to the students, because that's what you want the students at the end of the day to learn and to imitate. It's not so much about the content of what you say, but it's kind of the attitude that you have toward what you say, and the fact that there are these kind of open horizons. So even though in a sense we think that we've established certain kinds of things, there's still a real open world there, which in a way is meant to be an invitation for the students to become researchers themselves in their own lives, however they pursue that.
So this idea of learning through mimesis is interesting, Steve, because one of the reasons I still attend your lectures as your PhD supervisor is because they are these improvisational presentations of ideas. If anyone's seen Steve lecture, he doesn't use notes, he doesn't use PowerPoint, he just turns up and delivers. I've actually seen you do public engagement events. As you're walking up onto stage, you look at the organizer and go, how long have I got? And they go, 20 minutes. And you go, fine. And you go for 20 minutes and you end. And I asked you once, I'm not sure if you remember this, I asked you once, how did you learn to do that? And you looked at me with a wry smile and went, Jesuit education.
Yeah, actually, that's in the book.
I know.
So if you right. I mean, so part of what goes on in the book is not just a justification of this sort of ideal that I've been talking about, but also kind of how you do it, right? And I do think that's really an important thing, because the objection to PowerPoint that I have, and it runs through the book, is the fact that in a sense, the personality of the academic drops out. And so in a sense, almost anyone could be teaching you the stuff if it's only about content delivery. And that in a way explains a lot of how our universities are operating today, which if you're familiar with the way universities are operating, increasingly we're dealing with staff that are sort of short-term, and they're sort of recycling material. And there isn't really this kind of long-term, even lifelong commitment to learning, right, which an academic needs to have. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Humboldt in this context, because he's also the man who's responsible for formulating the ideal of academic freedom as we understand it. He's also part of that kind of mentality. And his phrase for academic freedom was Lehrfreiheit und Lernfreiheit. In other words, the freedom to teach and the freedom to learn. And for him, research was about learning. And in a sense, right, when academics talk about the kind of current work they're doing and how it's pushing forward the frontiers of knowledge, right, they're presenting that as a form of learning that they themselves are doing, right? So the kind of learning that you have, right, it's not just learning to do well on the exam, but it's rather a kind of learning for life that is always open to new possibilities in the future. And that is what the academic needs to get across in the classroom. And that was the original Humboldtian idea, which was an incredibly dynamizing force in enabling Germany to rise to the top rank of nations after being kind of a backwater, right? I mean, I think this is one of the things that people don't realize, right? If we're talking about the early 19th century in Europe, Germany is just a bunch of principalities. It's a kind of intellectual backwater to a large extent. And it's through the modern university that the talent got galvanized, and largely the academics were performing this kind of leadership role.
So what historically made the university at that time such a revolutionary place, and how do we perhaps retrieve some of that way of doing things?
Well, I think the key thing here is if you're looking at the turn from the 18th century to the 19th century, the period of revolution, right, the French Revolution in particular, right, you see an enormous disenchantment with established institutions, including universities as they were then, right, and these were basically religious-based institutions. And they were institutions that one went to, and one can think about Oxford and Cambridge exactly in this mold, by the way, as institutions you went into to enter into various forms of what we might call, generally speaking, administration, whether it's administration of the soul through theology, or administration of the body through medicine, or administration of the polis through law, right? Those were the primary reasons why one would go to university, would be to reproduce the social order in its various forms. And so the university itself was not seen as a place of enlightenment, to use that 18th century phrase. In fact, all the enlightenment was going on outside the university. And in fact, that had been largely the case actually since the 17th century during the period that we call the scientific revolution. So that somebody like Newton, who was a professor of mathematics at Cambridge, was more the exception than the rule with regard to the people who in fact made the big scientific breakthroughs in the 17th and the 18th centuries. So the universities were bastions of the establishment, bastions of tradition, right, where people were being taught the same thing over and over and over again. And so the question becomes then, is the university itself as an institution part of the problem? A lot of the Enlightenment figures definitely thought so. They thought the university ought to be got rid of. And that's where Humboldt is interesting, because he reinvents the university, where he makes the teaching and the research function kind of reciprocal, right, in a way. And he creates this new academic personality who's not just an establishment figure, but is rather a vanguard figure.
So are we there again? I mean, Rishi Sunak has famously said that people are going to university for these Mickey Mouse degrees.
Well, he's right about that.
Well, what do you mean by that? But are we at that same sort of question mark over the point of the university in the early 21st century? And how do we find a Humboldtian-esque figure to argue the importance of it?
Well, I think the university has got itself into a royal mess, let's put it that way, because basically it's become sort of trying to become all things to all people, and as a result, it's sort of hollowed out its own soul. So the university is going to be the place that is going to, as we're train people for the jobs of the future. Right? Universities are promising to do that, right? Universities are promising to do the kind of research that industry is going to like and all that, right? And as a result, what you get now, the kind of people who are being hired in universities are quite a motley crew of people who in a way might be functionally good at certain kinds of things, but by no means embody kind of the ideal of an academic as a personality. So if I have to say how do you know that the soul of the university is lost, is that there's nothing admirable about the academic personality, right? I mean, academics are just guys who run around trying to get grants, right? Or look for leave time whenever they can to go somewhere else. I mean, this is kind of the career trajectory of the contemporary academic, right? There is no sense of an academic ethos anymore, and the people who lack this academic ethos are successful, right? In the sense that they get high salaries, right? They're regarded as consultants, and so there is a real crisis, as it were, in terms of the academic identity. And so it is not surprising that students, politicians, and other people are actually quite skeptical and even cynical about the future of the university.
So what can be done to save the future of the university, Steve? I mean, how do we refashion the perception, both internally and externally, of what is possible at these sorts of institutions?
Well, I think this is actually a really tough issue, to be honest with you. And I think the current state of the university, where we have so many of them and they're claiming to do all things for all people, that is not sustainable. So there is going to be self-destruction, I think, in terms of the higher education sector, right? It's going to collapse, right? Because after a while, people are going to start holding universities accountable for all these miracles they claim to perform, which they cannot perform, right? And so then at that point, people are going to have to start thinking about, why do we need universities at all? And then they're going to go back to the foundational values of the kind that I'm talking about in the book. But there will be a kind of collapse that will have to take place. I think there will have to be a crisis, because people are not going to be paying the tuition fees they're currently paying for what little they actually get, because universities overpromise things they never should have been in the business of doing in the first place. Right? And so this is real. So the crisis of the university is going to come from within. The corruption is going to lead to collapse. And then there will be an opportunity, kind of like the Protestant Reformation after the collapse of the Catholic Church, right? From all the corruption that was there, where there can be kind of a rebuilding, right? And of course, there will be some institutions that will survive, of course, because in a sense, they still have enough of the values and there's still enough of a commitment to it. But I think a lot of the current institutions are going to be in serious trouble. And there's a sense in which we should let them be in trouble and see whether they survive or not.
All right, I feel like I'm going to be in trouble after this conversation. I'm sorry, the University of Warwick Institute for Engagement, but Steve, you are an academic at the University of Warwick. What do you think an institution like Warwick does particularly well that maybe we want to?
I have not
amplify.
I have not mentioned Warwick at all here, actually. Yeah. I think the fact that I'm still around after 24 years is I mean, I do think that is a kind of an important issue, right? The ability of academics to be able to find their way in the system and to be able to play to their strengths, okay? Because we obviously live in an academic culture where be regarded as a kind of high status member of academia, you have to be a big grant getter, for example. And getting grants means that you have to be chasing the trends, whether the trends are within academia or they're in industry or wherever the money is, as it were, to support academic research. But the question then is, suppose you're not in that game. Suppose you didn't go into academia for that reason, as I didn't go into it for that reason. If I wanted to make money, I would have gone into business, frankly. I don't know why, people want to go into academia to make a lot of money. But that does seem to be kind of something that drives a lot of what people do these days. But the question is, how many people can survive without doing that? Right? How many people can keep regular academic posts by doing just the sort of classic Humboldtian stuff of teaching and research without having to get involved in the money business? I think that is kind of the way you measure the value of a university these days, is by how many of those people you have on regular contracts. Because the problem is we are casualizing both the teaching and the research side to such a large extent, right, that nobody is actually encouraged, as it were, to think of a lifelong career that might be in those areas.
Well, one of the ways the universities are, I guess, judged is the Research Excellence Framework, which is coming up in about 4 years. How do you think that landscape is going to change? I mean, we could have a Labour government in 2 years. That may change how REF is viewed or will be rolled out. What do you think REF does to help a university or hinder a university to generate its identity, I guess?
Well, look, I think the Research Excellence Framework was always kind of based on a sort of false premise, in a sense that, in some sense, the way you actually show that academics are research active is by looking at how much they're publishing, right, and where they're publishing it. And I think what that has done in effect, and now the ref has been around for over 30 years, that it has basically kind of strengthened, in a sense, certain kinds of disciplinary identities, because if you know anything about the research excellence framework, basically you have committees of people from particular academic disciplines who judge the work of the people in all the different universities. And so it sort of reinforces disciplinary boundaries and stuff like that, and it tends to reinforce whatever happens to be kind of the current trends in academic fields. And one of the problems that we have with academic research in general, if you look at it kind of from a kind of holistic sociological standpoint, is that in fact, most of the stuff enormous amounts of stuff is being published all over the place, but most of it is actually systematically ignored because it is not contributing to what are regarded as the cutting edge areas. And you see the ref in a way reinforces that kind of cutting edge mentality where the only people who matter, or the people who matter the most, are the ones who are doing the things that all the big guys say you ought to be doing, right? And so the whole idea of free inquiry, the idea that you follow the truth wherever it may lead, right, which was very much part of the Humboldtian idea of the university, that falls by the wayside, because in fact most of the people who do follow, you know, the truth wherever it may lead get ignored, right? And they're not highly valued in the ref. And I think, again, the ref, I think, will eventually, it'll stop. It'll stop because, in a sense, this has become such a game that the outcomes of the ref in terms of what universities do well is fairly predictable now. And you know, in that sense, it's become so routinized that, but nevertheless, it costs an enormous amount of money to administer. So it's a great money waster, okay? It's a great money waster and time waster for academics. And I think once we actually, you know, we get all these various governments, these various neoliberal governments that are really interested in cutting costs and efficiency savings, well, ref would be one. Kill ref, right? And that would be a great efficiency saving, because it costs a lot of money and the outcomes you get are pretty predictable before you start. And I think that would be, you know, if people really had a kind of, you know, used a kind of economically steely eye on ref, they'd realize it's not value for money. The exercise is not value for money. End it on those grounds alone, even if you don't buy the more, you know, exalted kind of intellectual grounds I would be promoting. On sheer efficiency savings, you should cut it.
Not to be self-referential to the event that we're doing now, but where does things like public engagement figure in the promotion of ideas that you're talking about in that book?
Well, so the idea here, one of the things that I say about teaching, because again, right, if you think about this Humboldtian idea, the freedom to teach and the freedom to learn, it's clearly that teaching in a way is the key university function, and research is as it were the learning side of teaching, right? That's how he looked at it, right? Research isn't some separate thing, and I think part of what he has in mind, what Humboldt had in mind, and what I think turned out to be incredibly influential in terms of the enlightenment function of the university over the past couple of centuries, is the idea that when you teach something, right, the subject that you're teaching in a way that you learn it as a professional academic is of course highly technical in a way, right? You read these technical textbooks, the technical journal articles, books and stuff like that. And in a sense, you have become like the people whose books you read, right? When you become a professional academic. But the point is that the people who are in the classroom aren't those people, right? The people in the classroom have not had that kind of exposure to the technical language and the training and so forth. And so what you have to do is you have to, as it were, teach it to them from scratch, right? So teach it to them starting from their level. So in a sense, you have to, as it were, technically disarm yourself to a certain extent, right? You know, so this is why it's always very lazy teaching for academics to insist that people have to put stuff in a certain kind of way. They have to write in a certain kind of way. You have to use the jargon of a particular theorist or something like that in order to do well. Rather, the burden is on the academic to actually make the stuff that they think is important, right, important to the students. right? And that is, so in that respect, teaching is a public engagement activity. And so the kind of thing that, we're doing right now here is, in a sense, not so very different from what I feel does need to be done in the classroom every day, because students do need to be persuaded that what they're being taught isn't just something they're forced to be taught, right? But rather it is something they ought to want to learn. Right? And so that is where the teaching moves into the public engagement realm. And so this is why I talk about in the book, teaching is a kind of endless process of translation. Right? It is translating from the technical to the less technical, so that people who are not part of the original culture from which the research was done they're nevertheless able to have it and use it for their own purposes, which may take those ideas and findings in directions radically different from those who came up with them. And that is actually part of the democratizing function of the university in terms of the larger society, so that you don't have to just reproduce the past. You can take these ideas and push them in new directions.
Well, lazy teaching engenders lazy learning. So what can we learn from plagiarism and ChatGPT, the use of that by students, Steve?
Well, as some of you may know, especially with the ChatGPT thing, right, academics are hysterical about this, right? What is it going to do, right? One of the things that, so just, for those of you who aren't all that familiar with it, right? It's a kind of a generative artificial intelligence program, right? Where you can put a question in, like let's say an exam question or an essay question, and you get a little essay, right? And very often the essay, I would say, is kind of 2-1-ish, in terms of its quality. So it's not a first. It's
still a 2-1.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. No, exactly. No, that's the point. That's the point. So in that, often there are errors of fact, as people have pointed out about ChatGPT, but you should read student essays, right? People can get 2-1s in student essays and still have a couple of errors in them, right? So in this respect, if we're talking about real human performance compared to ChatGPT, right, 2-1 is kind of the ballpark. Now, when I look at that, right, I'm not too scared, because actually the kinds of questions that I ask students are actually very hard to generate decent ChatGPT answers to. Okay, I ask kind of more imaginative questions, creative questions, right? Where it is your ChatGPT answer wouldn't be so so impressive. But if you're asking textbook style questions, and again, you got to look at what academics actually ask students to produce in their exams and essays. Very often they're at that kind of Mickey Mouse textbook level because they're easier to mark. Right? You can tell what's right and what's wrong, and an academic doesn't want to spend too much time evaluating student papers, right? So you tend to Mickey Mouse it. Well, if you Mickey Mouse it, ChatGPT wins, right? And this is why academics are so much up in arms about it. But if academics raise their game in terms of what they expect out of their students, then ChatGPT wouldn't be such a big thing.
Yeah. So Steve runs a module called Sociology of Enzymes, which is about the apocalypse. It's 10 weeks of lectures about the apocalypse, everything from the end of the world to Ted Kaczynski. And the essay question is, should the world begin anew? And Steve actually gives the students the ChatGPT answers to that. There's one last question that I want to ask you, Steve, which is, despite all these things, you have established a method for effective learning. You call them the 3 R's: roam, record, rehearse. And that's a lesson that anybody here can take when they're interested in ideas. So could you just very quickly explain what the 3 R's are?
Okay, this goes back to my teenage years in New York when I was a student of Jesuits and all that jazz. So the thing is, I used to go to bookshops a lot. That's the roaming part, right? The browsing, right? And of course, to a large extent, this kind of function is not so spontaneous anymore because of our computer-based culture, which actually allows us to make much more targeted searches. So we actually end up not exposing ourselves to as much different stuff as we used to when we used to have to go to a bookshop and actually, browse the shelves and see what's cooking, right? And that's the roaming part, in brief terms, right? And the record part was I always took a lot of notes on what I read, right? I always took a lot of notes. And in fact, while I sometimes did marginal notes, I actually, generally speaking, had notebooks because I wanted to get my sense of what I was reading down in a relatively clear fashion, right? So it's not just parasitic on what I happen to be reading at the moment. So I have actually a lot of notebooks. I still have them, right? That's the record part. And then the rehearse part, that's really important from the standpoint of this kind of teaching, more public side of things, because I think you need to know your own mind, right? And that's why it's really important. I think, you know, the great actors also do this as well, right? That in a sense, you know, if you're thinking about something, you know, you run it through your mind. You kind of talk to yourself in a way, right? You sort of act it out. I mean, I do a lot of that, right? So you know, so even though in a sense, you know, some people think I just walk into the classroom and I'm just, you know, it's all boom, you know, but nevertheless, all this stuff has been roaming around, you know, it's been in my mind for a long time, and I've run through many possibilities. And so when I walk into a classroom, I have a sense of the kinds of things I need to say by the end of the hour, but the order in which they're said, how they're developed, and so forth, right, are subject to a lot of possible changes, right? Because in a sense, I have something like a map of different ways of playing it out in my mind, right? And that's the rehearsal part. And that's something that just, I would say, is kind of, you know, you might say sort of the background working conditions of being an academic. At least that's how I look at it. And so this is why all this stuff like PowerPoints and things like that, to me, seems really bush league, really unprofessional kind of stuff. It's like you don't know what you're doing. Right? When people are lip syncing to PowerPoints and they have PhDs in the subject, unless you're talking about really technical mathematical equations, I don't see the point.
And this is why we're doing what we're doing today. So you've been listening to Encounters live from 1 Mill Street in Leamington Spa. This event has been supported by Resonate, a project by the University of Warwick Institute for Engagement at the University of Warwick. My name is Luke Robert Mason. Please join me in thanking the inspiring Professor Steve Fuller for his talk this evening.
Thank you.